Hello guys, today we're going to be looking at the events that led to Civil War. So open up your notes to a brand new page, and at the very top, The Road to Civil War, Part 1. We're going to look at the events that happened between 1820 and 1860, and these are going to be split into two different sets of notes. The first set of notes is going to look at how people tried to avoid Civil War from happening, and then the second set is going to show how events actually added to a civil war, created more division in the United States. So for this first set of notes, we're just looking at the events where they tried to prevent civil war. And while you're writing that title, a couple of random facts for you. Did you know that 127 13-year-olds fought for the North in the Civil War? They lied about their age because you were not allowed to enter the war as a soldier at 13 years old, but they lied, ended up fighting in the war, 127 of them. Did you also know that the Civil War was incredibly expensive? Yeah, it was so expensive that one Civil War cost the same as it cost to fight 68 American revolutions. That's how much it cost the United States. 68 American revolutions. And then finally, the largest cannonball ever fired in the Civil War weighed 220 pounds, weighs more than I do, and those were the kind of shells the North and the South were lobbing against each other. So just a few random things for you. Now, you guys have spent a little bit of time looking at slavery. You have examined some documents that gave you an idea of what slavery was like and who some of the abolitionists were. And the next thing you need to understand is that in the 1800s, there were two legal ways of outlawing slavery. Just like nowadays, there are actually two ways. If you want to make something illegal, there are two ways of doing this. The first option is you can get each individual state to make something illegal. So back in the 1800s, each individual state could have said, we want slavery to be illegal. That's one way of abolishing or getting rid of slavery. Just like nowadays, if you want to get rid of something, each individual state can do it. And in the 1800s, many states had already done that. There were 22 states in the Union at the time. 11 of them in the North had already gotten rid of slavery legally by 1820. They had just voted it out and said, hey, it's illegal up here. That is an option. And people in the South weren't actually objecting to this option. Many of them living in the South believed that eventually slavery would die out on its own, that it wouldn't be a feasible economic plan, if you want to call some miserable way of treating human beings an economic system. They believed that it probably wasn't sustainable forever, and that eventually things would happen to where individual states would eventually get rid of it. What people in the South wanted to prevent was the other way that you can make something illegal or outlaw something in the United States, and that is for the federal government to just outright outlaw it. And the way that works is, of course, you have to introduce a bill in the Senate or the House of Representatives. It has to pass in both houses of Congress. So both the Senate and the House have to say, yes, we want to pass this bill, and then the president has to sign it. And then you can make something illegal by doing that. You can pass a law that makes something illegal. Now, Southerners did not want that option at all. And it's kind of for two reasons. The first reason is they didn't want the North telling them what to do. The North had a much bigger population, and they figured if the whole country outlaws it, then that's probably a decision that the North had a huge part in. They don't want the North telling them what to do, and attacking their way of life is how they would have put it. The other reason they did not want the entire country to outlaw it all at once is they were worried about the economic impact. What impact would it have on cotton production and tobacco? They worried that if suddenly their workforce was made illegal in a single day, that slavery was outlawed completely, that their economy would collapse, that people would starve because they wouldn't make any money being able to produce cotton or tobacco anymore. So those were kind of the two reasons they did not want the entire nation to outlaw this, okay? Now, again, like I said, slave owners feared the government was going to step over their bounds and outlaw slavery. So in the 1800s, if you look at all the history before the Civil War in the 1800s, what you are seeing is the South actively trying to stop the government from outlawing slavery. They're not trying to stop individual states from banning it. They just don't want a federal law that's going to get rid of all slavery all at once. So you'll see almost every action they take from the 1820s to right before 1860, they are actively trying to keep the government from passing this law. Now, if you look, the only way you can stop the law from being passed is if your side has more votes in either the House or the Senate. Now, in the House of Representatives, this is a problem because the House of Representatives is based off of population. We've talked about this before. And the North is bigger population-wise, which means in the House of Representatives, the South is always going to be outnumbered. So the South focuses on the Senate because in the Senate, every state sends 2 representatives. Essentially, you get 2 votes, okay? And they figure as long as they can keep the North from not getting more votes in the Senate, they will never be able to pass a law that outlaws slavery. So the South wants to keep the number of states that are slave versus non-slave the same. Now in 1819, there are 11 free states, states that don't allow slavery, and there are 11 slave states. And as long as it's 11 to 11, that means it's 22 to 22 as far as representatives in the Senate, one side can't outvote the other, and a law against slavery will never be passed. So for 40 years, they concentrate on trying to keep the balance. There's only one problem with this idea. What happens when a new state tries to join America? Because the moment a new state tries to join, it upsets the balance. And this is what causes a majority of the problems and compromises that need to be worked out before the Civil War when things upset the balance. Okay, so like I said, the problem is what happens when a new state enters. The numbers get upset, one side can outvote the other. If a state enters as a slave state, the people in the North are going to be upset. If a state enters as a free state, the people in the South are going to be upset. I hope that makes sense, okay? It all comes to a head in 1819. At the end of that year, Missouri wants to enter the United States as a slave state. Now, we call this whole thing the Missouri Compromise because it ends up being a problem. This upsets the balance in the Senate, and people in the North are furious at the South. They're saying, no, if you let this state enter the Union, it's going to start a war. We're going to be upset about this. We're going to start fighting each other over this. They need to work something out to maintain the balance and keep the status quo because both sides at this time really don't want a war. They don't like each other. The division's becoming more and more apparent, but they don't want to fight over it quite yet. So Missouri wants to join as a slave state, which is going to upset the balance. Now, a senator from Kentucky decides he's going to try and work out a compromise to restore the balance and work everything out again. His name is Henry Clay. He's a senator from Kentucky. He comes up with an idea that's going to try and restore a little bit of peace to this whole deal right now. It's a 3-step compromise. Here's how this works. Step number 1. He says Missouri can actually enter as a slave state. So they can go ahead and come on in as long as another state enters to balance it out. So step number 2, Maine, which formerly was known as Massachusetts, gets to enter as a free state. Now it's going to be 12-12 in the Senate, and the balance is kept. But he also puts one other thing into this compromise because deep down, Henry Clay is against slavery. He's from the North, technically, from Kentucky there. Well, okay, that's not quite true. He's from the South, but there's debate on this. Whether Kentucky should count as a northern state or a southern state during this time. But he is against slavery. He wants to see it die out eventually. And this is before the Mexican-American War, and he notices, hey, there's not a lot of territories left. So the third part of his compromise is he creates an imaginary line right there. Okay? And he says that from this point forward, whenever we have a new state enter the Union, they cannot be a slave state if they exist above this line. So if you notice, Mexico owns all this territory except for this Arkansas territory, which means at most the South might get 1 or 2 more states. and then they won't be able to add any more. And he realizes this means that eventually the North will have more states when like Oregon joins or some of these other states in here like the Dakotas, and eventually slavery will be forced to be illegal. And the South accepts this at the time. They're like, okay, we'll accept this for the moment. And this is the Missouri Compromise. Missouri enters as slave, Maine enters as free. They create this imaginary line because they know, hey, this land belongs to Mexico, which means there's no room for the South to expand slave states. Of course, the Mexican-American War, about 20 years later, 25 years later, completely ruins this entire compromise. Okay? We'll go ahead and skip ahead here. The Mexican-American War completely destroys this plan because once that war is fought and all this land is taken by the United States, California, Utah, New Mexico, all of those areas are below this Missouri Compromise line, which means they could all be potential slave states. And that means the North realizes slavery is going to continue longer than they anticipated. They are upset over this, and a new compromise is needed so that both sides calm down. You can see there's the line from the Missouri Compromise, and all of these states right here could potentially become slave states. So once again, the balance is threatened, and it gets really bad right after 1849. After the gold rush and all these people rush over to California, California wants to join America as a free state, anti-slave. But the problem is, part of California is below that line. So even though the majority of the people living in California want to be a free state, the southern states are like, wait a minute, this territory's below the line. California has to enter as a slave state. And it starts this fight all over again. All right? So a new compromise is needed because California wants to enter. They call this the Compromise of 1850. Don't worry, we're almost done here. This is the last compromise for the day. So this is 30 years later, a brand new compromise to try and figure out what are we going to do with California. Enter again, Henry Clay. 30 years later, still a senator, an old guy by this point, he comes up with a compromise that sort of saves the day on this deal, okay? And we call it the Compromise of 1850 because that's the year it takes place, okay? So another kind of three-step plan here. California gets to enter as a free state. Basically, that line from the Missouri Compromise is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. California enters as a free state. The line is destroyed, so that line from the Missouri Compromise does not exist anymore, which means from now on, all states will get to vote on whether or not slavery will be allowed in their territory. They call this popular sovereignty. The people will get to decide every time a new state is created on whether it will be slave or not. Now, the South likes this because they believe it's not going to lead to the immediate death of slavery. The North likes this because they believe that because the population of America is more anti-slavery than pro-slavery, that most of these new states are going to be free states. And they believe slavery will die out that way. Now, notice the South doesn't get a slave state immediately to counterbalance. They do very soon, so there is a counterbalance here. But they want something else as part of this compromise to guarantee that it's worth it for them. And the North concedes. They give them one thing in this compromise that they like, called the Fugitive Slave Act, or Fugitive Slave Law. A new law is created called the Fugitive Slave Law. So these are the three parts of the compromise. What was that law? Let's look at it really quick, and then we're done with today's set of notes. Okay? So the law is, the Fugitive Slave Act says that any escaped slaves, so any slave that tries to escape from the South, away from their owners, and flees into the North, must be returned to their original owners, even though they have reached free land. And it makes it a crime for any Northerner to harbor, to protect any slave who is on their way to freedom. Now, of course, this outrages Northerners. They look at this law and go, what? You are forcing me to have to return a slave to an owner even though I don't believe in slavery and this land is free land? That was part of this compromise, is that any slaves who ran away had to be returned. Now, of course, many Northerners completely ignored the law. If you read about it, the Fugitive Slave Act was one of the articles from last week, if anybody happened to read that particular one. Many people ignored it, which of course upset Southerners even more. They believed that the North was going back on the compromise. The Northerners believed that just putting this in the compromise to begin with was a bad idea, and that upset them. And both sides are getting angrier and angrier at each other. Then 5 specific events happen that take this anger and divide America even more, so much that it leads to civil war. We will look at those 5 events next time. But for now, these are things that happened before the Civil War, on the road to civil war, that led to greater division, even though the things we talked about today were trying to compromise to avoid that division. It didn't work. And we'll look at what happens afterwards very soon. Have a good day, guys.